You're listening to the Cyberwire Network, powered by N2K.
This episode is brought to you by Batiste Dry Shampoo. Whether you're on the go, at the gym, or getting ready for a night out, Batiste has a dry shampoo for you. Refresh with over 10 signature fragrances. Or try Batiste Hint of Color, a tinted dry shampoo that seamlessly blends with your hair. Need an extra boost? Try Batiste Dry Shampoo with added benefits like volumizing, texturizing, and more. Buy Batiste now, in-store or online at your nearest retailer.
And the assessment of the U.S. intelligence community is that they're there to enable them to do reconnaissance in those networks so that they can orchestrate a disruption or a destructive event in the case of conflict or in the lead up to conflict, so that you impact power in the United States, you impact water, particularly in places that are critical for U.S. military mobilization if you're going to choose to fight China in the Pacific and you need to flow forces to the region because we're obviously very far away. Cyber can play a really big role in that.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to Caveat, N2K Cyberwire's privacy, surveillance, law, and policy podcast. I'm Dave Bittner, and joining me is my co-host Ben Yellen from the University of Maryland Center for Health and Homeland Security. Hey there, Ben.
Hello, Dave.
On today's show, Ben reviews oral arguments in the TikTok case against the U.S. government. I look at the hunt for stingrays at the DNC convention. And later in the show, Ben's conversation with Dmitry Alperovitch, author and chairman of Silverado Policy Accelerator. They're talking about his new book, World on the Brink: How America Can Beat China in the Race for the 21st Century. While this show covers legal topics and Ben is a lawyer, the views expressed do not constitute legal advice. For official legal advice on any of the topics we cover, please contact your attorney. Hey everybody, Dave here. Have you ever wondered where your personal information is lurking online? Like many of you, I was concerned about my data being sold by data brokers. So I decided to try Delete Me. I have to say, Delete Me is a game changer. Within days of signing up, they started removing my personal information from hundreds of data brokers. I finally have peace of mind knowing my data privacy is protected. Delete Me's team does all the work for you with detailed reports, so you know exactly what's been done. Take control of your data and keep your private life private by signing up for Delete Me. Now at a special discount for our listeners. Today, get 20% off your Delete Me plan when you go to joindeleteme.com/N2K and use promo code N2K at checkout. The only way to get 20% off is to go to joindeleteme.com/N2K and enter code N2K at checkout. That's joindeleteme.com/N2K, code N2K. All right, Ben, we've got a lot to cover today. You want to start things off for us here?
So I'm going to disappoint a lot of teenagers and other members of Generation Z. I think TikTok's in a lot of trouble. I think it might end up being banned in the United States.
Okay, go on.
So to back up a little bit, Congress passed a law this past April, and President Biden signed it into law, that required TikTok's parent company ByteDance to be sold to an American entity lest it be banned in the United States. So banned from being sold or downloaded from one of our major app stores. One of the provisions in this law was expedited judicial review. So generally, this type of case would go to a federal district court, but this law specified that any litigation relating to this case would end up in front of the United States Circuit Court, which is the appeals court. So it has now gone in front of the Washington, D.C. Circuit Court of Appeals. It is a consolidated case. So TikTok, the company, has sued the United States government seeking to enjoin enforcement of this law. And then a bunch of TikTok influencers have joined the suit as well, asserting their own interests. So you have like people who do arts and crafts and have billions of followers. They're part of this litigation as well. In fact, they were in the courtroom and ironically making TikToks after oral arguments were over. So oral arguments took place this week in front of a 3-judge panel. To give you a little background on the three judges, one of them is Naomi Rao, who is a pretty hardcore conservative judge. One of them is Sri Srinivasan, who was appointed by President Obama, kind of a shortlister for a future Democratic nominee to the Supreme Court. And then Senior Judge Douglas Ginsburg. Now, Dave, you're a pretty old guy, not to put you on the spot here.
Oh, yes, Ben, I am a pretty old guy.
I don't know if you remember.
Why do you bring it up?
In the 1980s, Robert Bork was nominated.
I do.
And his nomination was defeated. So President Reagan went to his second option, which was Douglas Ginsburg, the judge in this case. Turns out he had to withdraw his name because he, in gasp, wait for it, smoked marijuana.
Yeah.
Those were the days. So
right,
Reagan ended up
picking. Can't have a stoner on the Supreme Court. No, sir.
Yeah, he's gonna get the munchies during oral arguments or something.
Right. Yes, I do remember. So this is the same Ginsburg.
Same Ginsburg.
Okay.
Yeah, he's just much older now.
Wow.
He's a senior circuit court judge, so he was sitting for this case. TikTok faced extremely skeptical questions about their constitutional claim in this case. Basically, what they're claiming is a couple of things. First, that this is a content-based restriction on their speech, meaning speech is being banned not on some type of content-neutral basis, which is generally more acceptable from a constitutional perspective, but because of the content itself. And if it is a content-based restriction, that means strict scrutiny applies. Strict scrutiny means that the government, to put it colloquially, has to have a damn good reason for passing the law, and the means for achieving the government's objective have to be narrowly tailored. So basically, it has to be the only possible way for the government to achieve that alternative.
So it's like a direct collision with the First Amendment.
It is. Yeah. And if this is considered under strict scrutiny, almost all cases considered under strict scrutiny, the government loses.
Okay.
They have a maybe 1 in 1,000 chance in a strict scrutiny case of winning, of the government passing strict scrutiny. So that makes a big difference. I do think, though, it's possible that the government in this case could pass strict scrutiny. The parties focused extensively, at least in the early part of the hearing, on whether strict scrutiny or what's called intermediate scrutiny would apply. If the restriction on speech or the alleged restriction is not content-based but content-neutral, then only intermediate scrutiny applies, meaning the government need only have an important interest that is substantially, and that the means have to be substantially related to the ends. So it's a bit of a lesser standard. What the government is arguing is that they can pass either of those standards, that they do have a compelling interest, which is to stop malign Chinese influence on our applications. That is in the interest of our national security. The source of the argument between the parties is this the only permissible way to achieve that objective? What the government would say is ByteDance has options here. They could sell the company to a United States entity that would not run afoul of the law. TikTok could continue in the United States. So they have options here. What ByteDance is saying is that's just not practical. The intellectual property related to the TikTok algorithm is owned by, or is certified, I guess, by the Chinese government, and China would not export that formula. Therefore, the app would be ineffective without that secret algorithmic juice.
Because it would be a hazard for Chinese national security.
Right. The irony of all ironies.
Right. Okay.
Yeah, they do not want to divulge those secrets.
Right.
So the judges asked some very pointed questions that I think were good questions. They raised this hypothetical of what would happen if the Chinese government purchased ABC News and we were at war with China, and the Chinese government used ABC News to propagate pro-Chinese, anti-American propaganda. Certainly, in that case, the government would have a compelling interest in forcing the sale of ABC News away from that Chinese entity, even if a court believed that there was some sort of free speech interest at stake here. In this case, it's not quite as obvious. They haven't taken over ABC News, but they are taking over one of the most popular applications in the country, used by millions of people. And it is not the Chinese government who owns the company necessarily, but ByteDance is beholden to the Chinese government, and at least the allegations are that they are sharing U.S. persons' data with the Chinese in a way that's dangerous to our national security. And I don't think the attorneys for TikTok had a great answer to that question, to that hypothetical. Congress has the power to restrict speech if they have a very compelling reason to do so, and if they think that the only method of achieving that objective is the ban at issue here. And I don't think there are enough alternatives, at least from a legal perspective, that the government could use instead of this blanket ban that would achieve the same objective. So I think TikTok's in a lot of trouble. I saw one legal scholar in the article that we're going to post in the show notes say that he thinks it's about a 2/3 chance that TikTok is going to lose in front of this Third Circuit Court of Appeals. And then it, of course, will be appealed up to the United States Supreme Court. But we're in the danger zone. I just kind of want to mention a weird element of all of this is I don't know if you've heard, Dave, but there's a presidential election coming up.
Oh, yeah. I think I heard something about that.
And both candidates are now prominent TikTok users. Like, the application is popular enough that the candidates feel they have to be on it creating content. Donald Trump, at one point, when he was president, tried to institute pretty much a similar ban on TikTok without a statute. So it was going to be from the executive branch. That got tied up in court. And he's kind of reversed his position since then, saying that he actually doesn't think TikTok represents some type of threat to United States national security. He's fine with it. I think he sees it as useful to his presidential campaign.
Okay.
And Vice President Harris, while not expressing any opinions on this dispute directly, is now a prolific TikTok user. Like, so many of the memes that have gone around about her candidacy are on TikTok.
Mm-hmm.
So the deadline for ByteDance to be sold to a U.S. entity is right before the next president is inaugurated. And I'm wondering if there's some chance, based on these two candidates' affinity for the application, that maybe this law is just not enforced after January 20th. I will hold that out as a possibility. I don't think it's a likely possibility, but I could foresee potential ways that could take place.
Yeah.
But the bottom line here is TikTok's in a lot of legal trouble, and we're going to get down to the wire to see whether it's banned in the United States.
Help me understand the intertwining between the national security concern and the free speech concern, because it seems to me that the national security concern overrides the free speech concern. But is that not necessarily the case?
It's not. It depends on each of the factors. So first, you have to make a determination that there is some type of free speech interest in play here.
Okay.
I think that's obviously true. Users have their own free speech interests. They want to have a platform to express themselves. And TikTok itself is a speaker. They put out some of their own content, and the individuals who put out the content, like TikTok's own content, those are U.S. persons, even though the parent company is owned by the Chinese. So they have their own free speech interests. Once you've made that determination that there are free speech interests at play here, then you have to determine the level of scrutiny that applies. No matter what level of scrutiny applies, we know at the very least the government has to have a very important objective in seeking to stop TikTok from existing in the United States. And their means of restricting it has to be very narrowly tailored to achieving that objective. To put that in layman's terms, if the government has a good enough reason to do something that is extremely compelling, and there would be no other way other than the proposed measure here to achieve that objective, then the government can stifle free speech, basically in any circumstance. There are other instances in constitutional jurisprudence where we've had these type of blanket bans on speech. There's something called prior restraint, which is like preventing somebody from publishing speech or publishing a news article prior to it being published. And that is constitutionally permissible in a limited number of circumstances. Like, if somebody sought to post battle plans for the United States Army while it was prosecuting a war wherever in Afghanistan, that would not be protected by the First Amendment. the government could issue a prior restraint on that for things like troop movements. So it's not unheard of to have a compelling national security interest supersede people's First Amendment rights. It's rare. First Amendment is very strong, but there are instances in which that does happen.
Is the federal government still leaving open the option for TikTok to sell to an American company, or are we at the point where that's off the table?
The government is egging them on, saying, we won't ban you. Just do whatever you have to do, sell to a U.S. entity, take whatever measure is necessary to bring you into compliance with this law. And we have no actual desire to ban TikTok in the United States. It's all about malign Chinese influence.
Okay.
But what ByteDance is saying is that that's just not practical for the reasons that we mentioned. What's valuable about TikTok is the algorithm and what gets put on people's For You page. And all of that is owned and controlled by Chinese entities. Those entities are not going to give up information on that algorithm to whichever U.S. entity purchased TikTok.
Yeah, that doesn't strike me as being compelling. I mean, to me, what's valuable about TikTok is the audience and anybody.
Right, and the brand. I mean,
right.
Yeah.
Anybody would be happy to have their startup out of the gate with that audience and that level of engagement. Even no matter what tweaking had to happen to the algorithm, that's a pretty good place to start.
And this is more your area of expertise than mine. But couldn't you jig up an algorithm pretty quickly? We have a lot of good examples of social media algorithms created by red-blooded Americans. Couldn't we just kind of jerry-rig it?
Yes.
I'm not sure that I'm completely persuaded either by ByteDance, their justification, but that's what they're saying. That's kind of their excuse for why they have not sold it yet.
So what happens next?
So we expect a decision in this case by early December. That's the timeline that the D.C. Circuit Court of Appeals has given.
And that's the accelerated timeline.
That is the accelerated timeline. For cases that we cover, that's that's the Usain Bolt of judicial cases.
Yeah.
So once we get that, the losing party will certainly appeal to the United States Supreme Court. And it's very possible the Supreme Court takes it up. It would probably have to hear the case under what's called its shadow docket, where they have to make a decision to temporarily stop the law or to let the law stay in place without having a full hearing with oral arguments. So that would be controversial, but I just don't think there's enough time prior to that mid-January deadline for the Supreme Court to go through briefs, oral arguments, and a decision. It's just too compressed of a time frame.
So you say mid-January deadline, that's inauguration?
Just about. I think it's a day before or 2 days before the inauguration.
Oh, I see. But it's not related to, it's a coincidence.
It's sort of a coincidence, but I think that date was purposeful and that this issue seemingly would be resolved before the next president took office. So there was no way that if they put it on January 22nd, then the new president could come in and say, but we're just not going to do this. They wanted some resolution to this issue prior to the next president taking office.
They being Congress.
Yes.
Got it.
Yep, our Congress critters.
All right. Ooh, boy. There's a lot going on with that one.
A lot. If you are a real nerd, oral arguments on this they were recorded on C-SPAN. You can look it up. Just a really interesting discussion of the relevant issues. It is a couple of hours. So, if you want to go on a nice walk and hear some compelling content on strict scrutiny and the First Amendment, highly recommend whipping up some C-SPAN.
All right. Hold me back. Don't threaten me with a good time.
With a good time, yep.
All right. Well, we will have a link to that story in the show notes. Ben, my story is our continuing inability to resist anything that has to do with a stingray.
We are suckers for the stingrays.
Well, I mean, maybe it's fair to say that for us, it is the shiniest of objects.
It is.
I think.
You could pretty much put any stingray story out there and we're going to bite.
Yeah. So this story's a couple of weeks old now, but I've been saving it for when we had a little break in the schedule here. And this is a story from Wired, and they went to the Democratic National Convention in Chicago. And they went there hunting for stingrays. They thought this is a prime location where if law enforcement is going to use a stingray, what better place than the DNC, right? There's going to be protests. There's lots of people here. There's lots of law enforcement. It's politically charged.
I don't know if you've any of you history buffs out there, but 2 times ago when we had a Democratic convention in Chicago, when there was unrest about foreign policy engagements, it did not go well. You can Google 1968 Democratic convention.
Yeah. So Wired went to the event, and they worked in concert with the EFF to come up with basically some gadgets that can listen to the RF spectrum and create a database of what is going on in that area. And, the thing about radio signals is that they travel. And
pretty far,
they're just there. Anybody can sense them, can detect them, with the right equipment. And that equipment is available. Some interesting tidbits here. One of the bits of software that Wired was using is called Ray Hunter. And it uses wireless hotspots, which basically allow the reporters to walk around the DNC. They have like little fanny packs that have the hardware in them. I'm imagining, I don't know if you remember there was an old bit years ago where Al Franken went to one of the conventions and he had a satellite dish on his head.
Amazingly enough, I do remember this.
Okay,
that was an incredible bit.
That's what I'm envisioning, but I'm sure it was much more discreet than that. But it turns out there are some indicators that you can look for to determine whether or not a cell site simulator is in play. One of them is that the network you're connected to tries to force you to downgrade to 2G. All right.
Red flag number 1.
Right.
Yeah.
So, these days, the vast majority of our connections are either 4G or 5G. If you've, had the television on in the past couple of years, there's no way you could miss the upgrade to 5G. It's probably the most advertised thing ever.
Right.
But 2G has much lower security capabilities built in, and the towers have the ability to force you to downgrade your connection. So that's a red flag.
It's kind of like when you go to a hotel and it's like, you could take the paid option, which is normal internet service.
Right.
Or we can give you the free option where you might be able to download an email.
Right,
and
dial up, yeah.
A series of several hours.
Right, exactly.
That's the 2G in this circumstance.
Yeah. The second tell is that the network asks your device for its IMSI number, which is sort of an individual identifier that wireless devices have. And then the final indicator is that if the network requests what's called a null cipher, which is the technical term for asking your phone not to use encryption between the phone and the tower. Okay?
Red flag.
Right.
Yeah.
So it says, listen, we're going to downgrade you to 2G. We want to know who you are, and we want to use no encryption. Chances are you might be connected to a Stingray.
I mean, I'm trying to think of the real world equivalent. It would be like, the police giving an announcement that you should keep your door wide open.
Yeah.
I don't even think there's a proper real world equivalent here to how vulnerable you are.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
And you should use outdated security cameras from the 1980s, which only show the most grainy images humanly possible.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, I can't say I'm surprised. I think that certainly the government, they probably should be obtaining warrants for the use of cell site simulators. But for such a major national security event like a political convention, I think they're trying to use all the tools at their disposal. I mean, there was a lot of concern that there were going to be violent protests.
Yeah.
And it's not just for people who have sincere concerns about what's going on in the Middle East. It's also for opportunists who just like to burn things.
Right.
And we might be able to identify some of those serial protesters who join legitimate protests and decide to throw Molotov cocktails for the thrill of it. Perhaps those people we could detect through the use of these types of surveillance tools. And I think that's the justification here. It is very interesting that Wired did this investigative work. And it's almost, I don't want to say laughable, but just how obvious it should be to anybody who's technologically literate that that's what's going on. But I'm going to guess, like, the vast majority of people, and correct me if I'm wrong, would never notice any of those things.
No, and it's designed to be that way. Because your device, other than being downgraded to 2G, your device still makes phone calls. It still connects. I guess you could look at your device and see that you're no longer connected to 5G. That most devices these days have a little logo that pops up.
Right, that says 5G LTE or whatever.
Right. Now, spoiler alert here. Wired found no cell site simulators deployed at the DNC. None. They captured just under 300,000 individual device signals. So that's everything from people's cell phones, things like Bluetooth headphones. They detected just over 2,500 police body cameras, which many police body cameras put out a wireless signal. They had 5 law enforcement drones, and this story is
kind of
interesting.
Surprised there weren't more law enforcement drones, to be honest.
Yeah, well, what's interesting is they were able to track the drones over the course of the events. Like they could say, oh, the drone's over this building now, and the next day they could say, oh, that drone is over here today, based on the electronic signature of the drones.
Right.
Yeah. And they were able to do that with some of the other devices that law enforcement used. They were surprised themselves that there seemed to be no cell site simulators here. So it's an interesting outcome. I guess I'm surprised that wasn't used. And
me too. I think there would have been good reason to use cell site simulators. Maybe it was the kind of legal questions surrounding them, and you don't want to instigate investigations where it would be fruit of the poisonous tree because the investigation started with the use of an illegal surveillance tool. At least illegal if it were used without a warrant.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I wonder too if there's the sort of the specter of it being non-neutral. In other words, if you're going to use a cell site simulator at the DNC's convention, you sure as heck better use one at the RNC's convention. That sort of thing where you have a politically charged event. Are they better kept to be used for, I'm going to use air quotes, neutral things, just, trying to go after gangs or, organized crime, things like that aren't as politically charged as general politics is at this particular moment in time?
Yeah. I do think you could come up with a justification why they might be needed at the DNC and not the RNC. For whatever reason, I think there was a greater chance of political protests this year at the DNC.
Right.
Partially it's because protesters for the Israel-Palestinian conflict think that they can influence Democratic policymakers. So that's why they tend to protest Democrats. They think that it's more likely to have an impact.
Uh-huh.
And they kind of leave Republicans alone because they just know they're not going to change Republicans' minds.
Uh-huh.
So I think that's certainly a possibility. So I can see that as being a possible justification, but you might be right that they're just very interested in maintaining that neutrality. There still were a lot of surveillance tools used, and I'm also wondering if it wasn't wired, but if it were, our adversaries overseas or even a domestic terrorist organization going in and doing this investigative work and identifying all of the surveillance tools and potentially figuring out ways to evade those tools. That kind of strikes a little bit of worry in me. I don't know if it does for you.
Yeah, it does. This article points out some of the history of these devices and that the U.S. accused Israel of setting one up across the street from the White House a few years ago. Israel denies, of course, but they're widely used. They seem to be fairly easily available. I mean, I suppose if you wanted to go down a tinfoil hat path, you could say that absence of evidence is not evidence of absence, and just the fact that Wired did not detect one of these devices doesn't mean that it wasn't there.
Maybe they're getting better. They're getting more undetectable.
That's right.
The government is outpacing the private sector, as it always does.
That's right. Hey, that's a line of thinking. I don't know
Not endorsing it, but yeah.
Right. Look, these devices, to be useful, they still have to operate within the boundaries of what our devices are doing, which is 4G and 5G connections. So, there's nothing mysterious about the specifications for our mobile device networks and Bluetooth and Wi-Fi and all those kinds of things. So, but who knows?
Who knows? Yeah.
This is an interesting article. If you are into this sort of thing, if you're at all curious about where different devices live on the radio spectrum and the ways that people can detect them and get better information about what's going on around you, there are all kinds of apps you can get from your app store, whether you have an iPhone or an Android device, that do similar things. You can go, what do they call it? War driving, where you're looking for Wi-Fi networks. There are apps that will tell you every Bluetooth device that's nearby. So this stuff isn't exotic. It's readily available. But
most people wouldn't think to use it, I
correct,
guess. Yeah.
Correct. And I suppose it's limited as to what's actually actionable if you gather up this sort of information as a normal person. It could be fun.
Yeah.
Right?
Totally. I can see how a hobbyist would do that.
Yeah. But anyway, this article I found interesting because it does go into a lot of those kinds of details. So if you're somebody who's interested in this kind of thing, this particular flavor of surveillance and also wireless devices in general, I recommend this story from Wired. And of course, we will have a link to that in our show notes. And of course, we would love to hear from you. If there's something you'd like us to consider for the show, you can email us. It's caveat@n2k.com. We'll be right back after this message from our show sponsor. Imagine this. Your primary identity provider goes down, whether it's a cloud outage, network issue, or even a cyber attack. Suddenly, your business grinds to a halt. But what if it didn't have to? Meet Identity Continuity from Strata, the game-changing solution that keeps your business running smoothly no matter what. Whether your cloud IDP crashes or your on-prem system faces a hiccup, Identity Continuity seamlessly shifts authentication to a secondary or even tertiary IDP, automatically and without disruption. Powered by the Mavericks Identity Orchestration Platform, Identity Continuity uses smart health checks to monitor your IDP's availability and instantly activates failover strategies tailored to your needs. When the coast is clear, it's a seamless switch back. No more downtime, no lost revenue, no frustrated customers. Just continuous, secure access to your critical applications every single time. Protect your business from the high costs of IDP outages. With Identity Continuity from Strata, downtime is a thing of the past. Learn more at strata.io. Keep your business moving even when the unexpected happens. That's strata.io. Ben, you had the pleasure of speaking with Dmitry Alperovich. He is author and chairman of the Silverado Policy Accelerator. And the topic of your conversation is Dmitry's latest book, World on the Brink: How America Can Beat China in the Race for the 21st Century. Here's the conversation.
So I couldn't put your book down, and I'm very thankful for our producer for sending it to me ahead of time. It is called World on the Brink. You have both a prologue and an introduction. My hunch is that most of your interviewers start with a prologue, so I'm going to start with the introduction. Your background is in what was then called information security, but then became cybersecurity. And your recent work has been in geopolitics. So I guess as a high-level question, what did you learn in the field of cybersecurity that gave you so much insight into geopolitics?
It's a great question. So first of all, I have to say that I've been focused on geopolitics really since college. So I have spent 25 years on that issue. It's always been a passion of mine. Took many courses in college. And then when I entered the cyber career, which was a very technical career, I immediately found myself enmeshed immersed in this field of geopolitics because at that time, cyber was blowing up. This is early 2000s with criminal activity that was mostly emanating from adversarial countries, particularly Russia, and later on some others as well. And then, 10 years in, we saw another explosion of nation state activity where you had military services, intelligence services of foreign countries, China, Iran, North Korea, Russia, infiltrating our companies to steal intellectual property, infiltrating our government networks. And it became a critical national security issue right away. And, I've had the fortune of being at the forefront of a lot of critical investigations that had been revealed over the last 15 years. That were truly groundbreaking in nature. The first major investigation into Chinese hacks of the private sector, hacks into Google and about 24 other companies that I named Operation Aurora in 2010. Operation Shady Rat, which was another Chinese hack into numerous industries over a 5-year period. The hack of the DNC by the Russians in 2016, the hack of Aramco by Iran in 2012, the hack of Sony in 2014 by North Korea. A lot of these really groundbreaking hacks that had taken place that were rooted in the geopolitical competition that we had with each of these foreign adversaries. And I coined a phrase back then, almost 15 years ago, that said, we don't have a cyber problem. We have a China, Russia, Iran, and North Korea problem, because fundamentally those countries are using cyber to achieve their geopolitical objectives, right? If war is politics by other means, diplomacy by other means, as Clausewitz famously said, well, so is cyber, is effectively another way to achieve your ultimate national security objectives. So I've been immersed in that field for the last 15 years, looking at how cyber is helping to drive the geopolitical agendas of all those countries. In the case of China, for example, being at the forefront of a lot of these investigations into intellectual property theft across numerous industries and numerous countries. I was saying this is not about cyber hacks. This is not even about theft of IP. This is about economic warfare that China is waging against our nation, against other nations as well. And the response to that can be in cyber.
Do you see any parallels between how the broader industry saw cybersecurity in the 2000s, basically as, well, this is a problem with our network or a problem with this specific malware, versus how we view the threat landscape today in kind of a way that's too narrow and not big picture enough?
I do. And I think this is part of the reason why I wanted to write this book, is that we lack a grand strategy in our thinking, that we are very tactical. We tend to respond to individual threats and look at them in isolation without looking at the bigger picture of what is it that we're actually trying to achieve, right? One of the big questions with China, for example, is not just what is the nature of the threat from China, where we are mostly coming to a bipartisan agreement on the problem that China represents to the United States hegemony, our economic and national security. But there is very little discussion, not even a debate, but even little discussion of what is the end goal that we're trying to achieve with regards to China? Where do we want to end up? We had that clarity in the Cold War, right? The containment strategy articulated first by George Kennan, of course, in the 1940s, right after World War II, was that we are pursuing containment because the Soviet Union is a natural phenomena that would one day disappear, right? He had that insight in 1946. And we were marching towards that goal of waiting them out until they collapse. Well, China is not going to collapse, right? It's an ancient civilization that's been around for 5,000 years, will likely be around for another 5,000 years or longer. So what is it that we want to achieve vis-a-vis China? And that's a question that I attempted to answer in my book, or at least propose as an answer, and try to get at least the conversation going. Because if you don't know the destination, how are you going to get there?
One thing that struck me about your book is that you argue pretty explicitly that our concerns about China should subsume our concerns about other geopolitical conflicts. Can you just explain that a little bit? Like, to a person who's just learning about this conflict, why is this more important than Russia or Ukraine or Israel or Gaza?
So all of these problems, Iran, North Korea, Russia, and many others are real issues, right? Climate change, et cetera. And I'm not suggesting that we should ignore all of them and only focus on China. Far from it. We have to manage a lot of conflicts, a lot of interests that are at play as a global superpower that we are. However, there is only one truly existential threat to the United States, to our economy, to our national security, and frankly, even to our climate. And that is a conflict with China, right? So even if you're someone who's completely focused on climate change and the threat that it represents, which is significant, any attempt to reduce carbon emissions globally is going to go straight out the window if you're in a devastating war with China, right? So I believe that is the fundamental problem that we're facing as a potential in the next 48 years, as I suggest in the book. And we have to do everything in our power to avoid it. And that's why everything that we're doing around the world, we should not abandon, but we should be looking at it through the lens of this deterrent mission that we're on to prevent another world war, to prevent a devastating conflict. And we should be asking the question, is this important enough to take away that focus for us? And some things will be, but many others will not, right? And we should also be asking, is it helping us in our efforts to achieve that outcome? So just like everything in the first Cold War was looked at through the lens of the great competition with the Soviet Union, not always helpfully, there have been mistakes and plenty of them, right? Vietnam, the most prominent. But nevertheless, when you look at that entire period from 1945 till 1991 effectively, it was, by and large, a good policy of the United States with terrible mistakes along the way to outlast the Soviet Union, to wait out till they collapse, right? And that focus that we had was really vital to the success of that endeavor. And we need to bring that focus again.
So just to kind of, before we get to some of your proposed solutions, which I think is the most important part of your book, can you lay out, I don't know if it's your worst case scenario threat landscape, but what you describe in the prologue of your book is a very well-articulated scenario of China invading Taiwan days after the 2028 presidential election. Can you talk about what that would look like, what the next steps would be? Just kind of describe that scenario for us so we can have a better idea of the nature of the threat.
Sure. So for military history, military strategy junkies, they will find that prologue quite interesting. Spend a lot of time on it, looking at realistically, how would you do this if you're China? And this is very, very hard to pull off. If they manage to do it, it will be the most complicated military operation in the history of humanity, by far. This island is a natural fortress. It is surrounded by very rough waters, primarily in the Taiwan Strait, which is practically impassable half the year to anything but huge container ships. You've got stormy weathers, you've got fog. So really big challenge to cross it. And then when you land on this island, you've got mountains, you've got rivers, you've got just a really tough terrain to try to capture. This is not the plains of Ukraine. And this was appreciated for a very long time because there have been, as I go through the history of Taiwan and China in this book, there have been numerous attempts over centuries to conquer this island, largely unsuccessfully or only partially successful. And only one finally succeeded, which was the Japanese in the late 1800s that finally managed to subdue the tribesmen that were on this island and take full control of that island. That was the first time when any outside force actually fully controlled Taiwan. It was not China, which only had very partial control of it. It was Japan. And then again in 1944, literally as we're speaking, this is the 80th anniversary of a plan to invade Taiwan that was put together by the Joint Staff in August of 1944, 2 months after the most successful amphibious invasion in history, Operation Overlord, D-Day, to take Normandy. Right. And D-Day, of course, involved about 150, 160,000 Allied forces crossing the English Channel, which is roughly the same size as the Taiwan Strait, landing on the beaches of Normandy and ultimately taking France and going into Germany from there. But on the heels of that incredible success, the planners in the U.S. military who had obviously learned all the lessons, the good and the bad, from D-Day, put together a plan to invade Taiwan, which had about 60,000 Japanese forces entrenched on that island, a smaller force than the Chinese would be facing today with the Taiwanese military. And they doubled the number. They went from 150,000 for D-Day to over 300,000 for Taiwan, and estimated enormous casualties. One estimate called for 45,000 American casualties in that operation. D-Day, just by comparison, on that one day, we lost about 2,500 Americans, right? So just incredible level of loss. And ultimately, President Roosevelt, General Douglas MacArthur, and others looked at this plan and said, no, this is too hard. This is too costly. We're not going to do this. We're going to bypass Taiwan entirely, and we're going to go for Okinawa. So even 80 years ago, for the U.S. military that was sort of drunk on the success of Operation Overlord, they knew that this was tough, right? Well, in the ensuing 80 years, this has only gotten tougher. Obviously, defensive technologies have improved dramatically, anti-ship missiles, drones, smart mines, all sorts of capabilities that the Taiwanese now have that makes this much, much harder for the Chinese to pull off. So the prologue really goes through a scenario that I think is a very realistic scenario of how you would achieve this if you're China. Very difficult, very risky, but it's probably a more realistic scenario. It abandons a lot of the myths around how this invasion would go. One of them, most prominent, is that they would need to take the beaches. My invasion plan does not rely on the beaches at all. In fact, I think the beaches are a distraction. And by the way, the U.S. military agreed in 1944 and did not do a beach invasion like they did with Normandy when they were putting together the plan for Taiwan. They focused on the port facilities. I think they remain essential because the beaches on Taiwan are very small. The waters there are very shallow and very rough. So your ability to bring in massive amounts of troops and logistics onto those beaches is going to be very, very limited. So if you can't take that infrastructure, the port facilities, the airfields, I don't think this is doable at all. And I talk about in the prologue how you would accomplish it step by step. I don't go through the other side of the plan, which is how would Taiwanese respond to it. But purely looking at it from China's perspective, this is how I think they're likely to try this if they should do so. But the other side of this coin is the stakes, right? The stakes of China either successfully taking Taiwan or fighting a prolonged battle over Taiwan, either just with the Taiwanese or with the U.S. military involved, are dramatic for the entire world. Obviously, very dramatic for us as well in the United States. First of all, economically, right? Taiwan, the world economy depends on Taiwan, right? Taiwan produces about 40% of all semiconductors. In our digital age, nothing can be built.
That was something that really stuck out to me in the book. I didn't realize the percentage was that high.
Yeah, 40% of all semiconductors, 90% of all advanced semiconductors are coming from Taiwan, which, by the way, is not going to change in the foreseeable future. Despite the successes of the CHIPS Act, which was passed by U.S. Congress in 2022 to invest about $75 billion in domestic industry, it is a drop in the bucket compared to what you'd need to actually displace Taiwan, and it's just not going to happen in the coming decade. Zero chance of that. So Taiwan is going to remain important. You take that capacity offline temporarily or permanently, you go into global depression. Estimates are you lose about $10 trillion of economic value right off the bat in the first year. So something on the scale you haven't seen since the global depression of the 1930s. And then, of course, if you're in an actual hot conflict with China, if the United States chooses to fight for Taiwan, well, you're in a conflict you haven't seen since World War II in terms of intensity, casualties, threat to the mainland United States, because the chances that it would be contained to the Pacific are not great. And you also have the potential for escalation to a nuclear level because, for the first time since 1945, two major nuclear superpowers would be fighting each other. You had a small conflict between India and Pakistan in 1999 in Kashmir. But outside of that, you've never had two nuclear powers fighting each other directly. So very, very dangerous on every level.
So before we get into some of your proposed solutions, I think there are kind of the macro solutions that you propose in the book. But this is a cybersecurity podcast. And just from the perspective of somebody who's in the private sector, who works in Silicon Valley, who works as a startup, can you explain the significance of this potential conflict to that type of person, why they should care about this, and then what they can do even in their capacity as a private company or through public advocacy to help address this problem?
Sure. Well, I would argue, regardless of where you are, this is really important and vital because, again, as I mentioned, the potential for war over Taiwan with China is going to affect everyone, and no one is be left untouched by it. But in cyber in particular, this is very acute because of a threat group known as Volt Typhoon, right? This is a threat group that the U.S. government talks a lot about, tied to the Chinese government, that has been breaking into critical infrastructure around this nation for several years now, and not doing the traditional things that you've seen from China, which is focus on companies where there's really great trade secrets or intellectual property that they can steal and give to their domestic companies in order to allow them to better compete against Western companies. What they are doing is they're breaking into electric utilities, water utilities, places that don't really have significant trade secrets or intellectual property that you would want. And they're not actually stealing anything. They're implanting themselves into these networks and remaining there, maintaining persistence. And the assessment of the U.S. intelligence community is that they're there to enable them to do reconnaissance in those networks so that they can orchestrate a disruption or a destructive event in the case of conflict or in the lead up to conflict, so that you impact power in the United States, you impact water, particularly in places that are critical for U.S. military mobilization if you're going to choose to fight China in the Pacific and you need to flow forces to the region because we're obviously very far away. Cyber can play a really big role in that. So if you are in the cyber field, you are essentially in the front lines of this conflict, fighting the Chinese military as they're doing these infiltrations into our critical infrastructure.
Well, then switching gears and talking about what your recommendations would be to help ameliorate this problem before we get into the 2028 scenario that you described. What are those concrete steps that our governments can take, that our private institutions can take in preparation for something like this?
Yeah. So there's a lot of this in the book. Again, I encourage people to read it. World on the Brink, How America Could Beat China in the Race for the 21st Century. I'll talk about three high-level ideas. So the first one centers really on Taiwan itself. And you have to deter this invasion at all costs, I believe. I think Xi Jinping is committed to taking Taiwan in his lifetime. The man is 71 and is looking potentially at the next 10 years or so of him being in power to accomplish this task. And a lot of that depends on hard power, military power, both Taiwanese investments that they have to make and other allied forces like the Japanese, but also us and reforms to our defense industrial base. And there's a lot of that in the book. The second one is we need to increase our economic leverage over China and decrease their economic leverage over us. And the second piece is very important because if Xi Jinping looks at the world and sees that the United States is so dependent on China for procuring semiconductors, for procuring critical minerals and solar panels and batteries and electric vehicles, he might say, rightly or wrongly, that there's no way they're going to fight us. This is going to be so devastating to them economically if I cut them off that I can deter them from coming in. And if the United States is not coming in, that means Japan and Australia are not coming in. That means Taiwan is on its own and I can take it. We don't want him to think that. So as a result, we have to not decouple. And I coined this phrase in the book. I call it unidirectional entanglement. What you essentially want is to create this asymmetric dependency with China where we're less dependent on them, but they're more dependent on us in areas like semiconductors, like biotech, and many others. And that requires a number of things. It requires us to prevent Chinese from building their own chip independence, essentially achieving chip breakout capability, which we can do because all of the equipment that you need to build semiconductors is produced by Western companies. In fact, three of them in particular, United States, Netherlands with ASML, and Japan, are responsible for the vast majority of semiconductor manufacturing equipment. So if you cut them off and you cut off the maintenance and the parts that are going to that equipment, their industry will collapse effectively. So that means that they'll be more dependent on buying chips from us and Taiwan and others rather than building them themselves. And we'll be less dependent on them because we won't be buying their chips, right? Secondly, you need to secure the critical material supply chain. And the reality is that it depends on mineral by mineral, but roughly speaking, China processes and refines about 90% of the world's critical minerals, whether it's rare earths or cobalt or nickel, lithium, you name it. Now, processing and refining materials is not rocket science. We know how to do it. The technologies are well known. We just have to do it. And in many cases, we can do it better than China because we will actually do it to higher environmental standard than they will. And if you're worried about things like pollution and climate change, you have to worry about what China is doing because it's one planet, right? If they're polluting in China and releasing CO2 into the atmosphere, it's just as bad for us as it would be if we were doing it here in the United States. So you have to prevent China from holding us hostage in that critical minerals market by diversifying production, both friendshoring and onshoring it to refine and process these minerals. Mining is a little bit of an issue, less so than the processing and refining because there are lots of mines around the world. Some of them are owned by China, not all of them. We need to make sure that they don't capture the entire ecosystem, of course, but we have alternatives there. And we have to invest in innovation. You have to invest in AI and autonomy, biotech and synthetic biology, space technologies, green tech technologies, et cetera, to make sure that we remain at the forefront of innovation in all those spaces that will really dictate who will win the 21st century. And I argue we have to enable skill-based immigration to this country. We need top talent. It's better for us when people come to this country and create new businesses, create new innovations, new opportunities, create jobs. Right? You look at the top companies in the world by market cap: Microsoft, NVIDIA, Google, Apple, Tesla, and SpaceX. They're all either have been founded by immigrants or children of immigrants. Every single one of those, right? Or are run by them right now. So there's even just at that top level, you have an incredible advantage that immigrants bring to this country. And by the way, it also weakens our adversaries. Imagine if we were able to take the top people out of China and bring them here and have them contribute to our economy versus China's, right? It's a no-brainer. And then the last piece is defending innovation. You have to reform the defense industrial base to focus on more asymmetry, focusing on quantity versus quality, reducing costs, because the reality is we've become too enamored with weapons platforms that are too expensive for us to buy in the quantities that we need to. They may be great, but if you can buy only a few of them, it doesn't actually matter. So that needs to be a really big focus for us. We need to sanction IP theft that is undermining our economic advantage that China continues to prosecute, that has been for the last 25 years. And you need to engage in new alliance frameworks. I call for a new framework, sort of an economic NATO idea that I call Treaty of Allied Market Economies, where you can help other countries that have come under Chinese coercion from, you can help them to deter this coercion by banding together and engaging in collective punishment against any aggressor that engages in this type of activity.
Well, the book is World on the Brink. It was such a pleasure to speak with you and to get your perspective, and highly encourage everybody to read the book. As I said, once I picked it up, I couldn't put it down. So thank you very much for joining us.
Thanks so much for having me, Ben.
Really interesting, Ben. I've had the pleasure of interviewing Dmitry a few times over the years, my work with the Cyberwire, and boy, it is always time well spent.
Yeah, he's a fascinating person, brilliant. He has incredible foresight. I mean, he was one of the earliest people to accurately predict that Russia was about to invade Ukraine. And I think the book, which I picked up and couldn't put down, really outlined the threats of a potential Chinese invasion of Taiwan. I think that's the kind of narrow thing that he's predicting after the 2028 election, but just also what our advantages are vis-a-vis China and how we can leverage those to come out on top in this conflict. So I thought it was a great conversation. He's a great guest, and I was really glad to have the opportunity to speak with him. As
you read through the book, I mean, the recommendations he makes, do you find them realistic or potentially achievable?
Totally. Yeah, I mean, none of these are pie in the sky. It's mostly leveraging the resources that we already have. I think there's this kind of doomerism that creeps in, that we've lost every advantage to China, all of our technological prowess from the mid to late 20th century. We've ceded that to China. And I think he starts from a premise that that's just not necessarily true. And that China in many ways is no longer ascendant in the way they were at the beginning of the century. So yeah, I was persuaded.
Well, again, our thanks to Dmitry Alperovich. The book is titled World on the Brink, How America Can Beat China in the Race for the 21st Century. We appreciate him taking the time for us. And now, a word from our sponsor, Cortex. Security teams face a barrage of more security tools create more complexity. More devices need protection. More specialized focus areas create more silos. The security landscape is changing fast. How can security operations transform to meet current threats? Cortex by Palo Alto Networks consolidates SecOps tools into an integrated platform and helps organizations stop threats at scale with AI, automation, and analytics. Learn more at paloaltonetworks.com/Cortex. That is Caveat, brought to you by N2K Cyberwire. We'd love to know what you think of this podcast. Your feedback ensures we deliver the insights that keep you a step ahead in the rapidly changing world of cybersecurity. If you like our show, please share a rating and review in your favorite podcast app. Please also fill out the survey in the show notes or send an email to caveat@n2k.com. We're privileged that N2K Cyberwire is part of the daily routine of the most influential leaders and operators in the public and private sector, from the Fortune 500 to many of the world's preeminent intelligence and law enforcement agencies. N2K makes it easy for companies to optimize your biggest investment, your people. We make you smarter about your teams while making your teams smarter. Learn how at n2k.com. This episode is produced by Liz Stokes. Our executive producer is Jennifer Iben. The show is mixed by Trey Hester. Our executive editor is Brandon Karpf. Peter Kilpie is our publisher. I'm Dave Bittner.
And I'm Ben Yellen.
Thanks for listening.